In December of 2014, a little girl by the name of Molly was brutally murdered in Windsor, Ontario. And when the police arrived on scene, which was the home that Molly had lived in for about 7 months, they found her together with her mother, Cassandra, who had been bludgeoned to death. The man who perpetrated these horrible crimes against Cassandra and Molly was later caught and charged with first-degree murder. But while justice was brought for Cassandra, it was not for Molly. While her father Jeff mourned 2 deaths, only 1 was legally recognized. How is that possible? Because in Canada, unless you have fully emerged from your mother's body, you are not recognized as a human being under the law. And Molly hadn't been born yet. And so because of that, in our country, you can stab a woman in the abdomen in order to kill her preborn child, and you can get away with it. And that needs to change. Around the time that Molly was killed, there was a couple in British Columbia who was eagerly anticipating the birth of their first child. And as many people do, around 20 weeks, they had an ultrasound done to determine the gender of their baby. But when the results came back, instead of celebrating by buying a bouquet of flowers or perhaps a onesie, they made an appointment, got into their vehicle, and drove to a clinic for a so-called dilation and evacuation abortion. And so after the woman's cervix was dilated, the doctor inserted forceps and grasped a limb and twisted it off and pulled it out. And then he went back in and grasped onto another limb and twisted it off and pulled that out as well. Until finally, only the head was left. And he went back in with those forceps and he grasped that little head and crushed the skull and pulled that out as well. How is that possible? Because there are communities in our country where girls are devalued to such an extent that rather than giving birth to these girls and placing them for adoption, they have them decapitated, dismembered, and disemboweled. The Canadian Medical Association Journal reported in a study in 2012 that there are areas in Canada where there are many more boys being born than girls. And that is precisely for this reason. That needs to change as well. But the little girl who died that day was not the only girl. Hundreds of boys and girls were walked to their deaths in hospitals and abortion clinics across our nation, many of them through a procedure called a dilation and curettage abortion, where a vacuum pump is hooked up to a curette and a developing human being is suctioned to pieces. And so an unrepeatable, irreplaceable human being of unimaginable worth is reduced to an unrecognizable, bloody mess. How is that possible? Because in our country, you can have an abortion for any reason or no reason whatsoever. You can have an abortion because your baby is a girl and you don't want a girl. You can have an abortion because your baby has Down syndrome and you don't want a child with Down syndrome. You can even have an abortion because your pregnancy interferes with your holiday plans to go to Hawaii. That actually happens. And so in Canada, you can have human rights. You just have to be born first. Recently, my oldest son Jonah went to kindergarten for the very first time. And it struck me that on the day that Jonah learned how to write the letter S and on the day that he colored a picture together with all the kids in his class, the equivalent of 15 kindergarten classes full of children was killed. That day, and the next day, and the next day, and also today. So what do we do? What do we do in the face of such an injustice? Well, the Apostle Paul tells us not only to abstain from the deeds of darkness, but also to expose them. And every effective movement that fought and ended the injustice of their time has done just that. And so what we at the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform do is not new or revolutionary. We simply try to expose the injustice and we follow in the footsteps of social reform movements of the past. That's why we show the humanity of preborn children in all their beauty. And we show the inhumane nature of abortion in all its ugliness. Now maybe you say, but what can I do? You do that on the streets and with your pro-life activist colleagues, but what can I do? I want to encourage you to do everything you can to expose the injustice of abortion, and that doesn't have to be that hard. One thing you can do is use our little choice cards that show a first trimester abortion. Recently at a presentation, a girl came to me and said that whenever she takes public transit, she puts a choice card underneath her leg, and as she walks away, it is there for another person to find. On my way here, I shared one with my taxi driver. Recently on a flight to Saskatoon, I talked to the person beside him and asked him if I could show him what abortion does. That's how we expose injustice. And a friend not too long ago told me that whenever she goes shopping, she puts a little choice card in all the pockets of the pants that are hanging on the rack for the person to find at home or in the change room. Those are easy ways for us to make sure that everyone knows what abortion does to the youngest of our kind. I also want to encourage you to go to our website, endthekilling.ca, and use what you get there, articles and blog posts and videos on social media, to be a pro-life presence on social media. Now maybe you say, okay, but what difference is that going to make? Because most of my friends are pro-life or people don't agree with me. Well, an acquaintance of one of my colleagues was Facebook friends with her for a very long time before they actually started talking and before they became friends. And only now do we know that this acquaintance had said that if she got pregnant while in university, she was definitely going to have an abortion. But then my colleague shared pro-life post after pro-life post on Facebook and showed pictures of what abortion does to the bodies of preborn children, and she decided from then on she could no longer have an abortion. We only know that because she told us many months later. And so when you share that kind of information, it can affect the lives of the people who are watching their newsfeed. But of course, if a discussion comes up on Facebook, meet with people one-on-one. Facebook discussions are hardly ever effective. And so offer to take the people out for coffee and to have a conversation about this. Use it as a tool. And I also want to encourage you to join or start an activism group in your area to expose the injustice on the streets of your town or city. Why? Because in order to change the culture, we must engage our culture. That's why at CCBR we have come up with projects that do just that. And one of those projects is Choice Chain, where we stand on the streets and contrast prenatal imagery with abortion victim photography. Well, some time ago, my colleague Devorah was standing on the streets of Toronto when a woman was walking down the sidewalk and she was clearly in a rush. And so Devorah, in order to get her attention, extended her hand out with a pamphlet and said, "What do you think about abortion?" The woman grabbed the pamphlet, she then kept walking, opened the pamphlet, and stopped. "Abortion," she said. "Abortion kills a baby." Devorah agreed with her, and then they talked about what we can do to make sure that other people know that too. And at the end of that conversation, Devorah asked her how seeing these pictures had impacted her. And she said, "Oh, I used to be pro-choice until I opened your pamphlet." She had believed the lie that abortion was simply a woman's choice until she saw what was actually chosen. Sometime later, I was standing on the streets too with one of our projects, and there was a woman who had been really angry, and she'd been yelling and screaming at my colleagues, and in the middle of a conversation, she walked away, but she came my way. And so I thought, well, I might as well try before she leaves. And so I asked her, "What do you think about abortion?" And she said, "I will suck a fetus out of my uterus if I want to." Well, the Bible tells us that a soft answer turns away wrath. And so I simply asked her, "How come?" And then she started talking about some of the difficult circumstances that women face that drive them to abortion. And I agreed with her that we should do everything we can to help women in situations like that and that they deserve our support. And then I asked her a question. Shouldn't we do everything we can to eliminate suffering without killing sufferers? She then looked at my sign and said, "Okay, but that's not a human being. That's not a person." And I said, "Well, can I ask you a different question? "Do you believe in human rights?" What do you think she said? Of course. And so my follow-up question was, who gets human rights? "Well, humans," she said. I said, "Okay, and so if two human parents reproduce, what is their offspring?" "Human," she said. I said, "And if something is growing, doesn't that tell us that it is alive?" And she agreed. And so I said, if from the moment of fertilization we have a living, growing human being and abortion ends the life of that human being, isn't that a human rights violation? At the end of our conversation, she said, "I don't dare to call myself pro-life just yet. But if you explain it like that, it makes perfect sense to be against abortion." See, that's what happens when we engage our culture, when we present the human rights argument and we show prenatal imagery and abortion victim photography. That's why another project that we have come up with is one that we set up on university campuses, where we engage with students, sometimes for hours at a time. And every year, in February, we take a large group of students to Florida, where we first train them, and then we do outreach on various campuses. Well, several years ago, my colleague Jonathan, whom you see here, had received this training, and he tells me that he was ready to take on any abortion advocate that came his way. Well, the first person who walked his way was an African-American woman whom he asked, "What do you think about abortion?" She looked at him and said, "I had one a few weeks ago." All of a sudden, Jonathan didn't know what to say anymore, because he could explain to her that the preborn are human beings like us, but it was too late. He could show her that abortion ends the life of vulnerable children, but her baby was already dead. And so, all of a sudden, self-conscious about the pictures he was standing in front of, he asked her, "What do you think about the pictures then?" And as tears welled up in her eyes, she said, "Nobody told me it looked like that." In a country where millions of people call themselves pro-life and millions of people call themselves Christian, the only person who had talked to this girl about abortion was the doctor who took her money and then killed her baby. Shortly after, she had to go to class, and so Jonathan offered to walk with her. And during that walk, she told him how she had tattooed the name Raven across her abdomen, close to the place where her little girl had lived for only a short time. Now, it was difficult for her to see these pictures. But if we had been there only a few weeks earlier, little Raven might have still been alive. That's why we know it isn't tragic when women see these pictures, but it is tragic when they don't see them in time. Thankfully, we're not always too late. And so we do activism on the streets to make sure that no one will ever be able to say again, "Nobody told me." One of the things CCBR does is organize a crash course. And so every year at the end of the summer, people come from all over the country and we provide training for them, and then they join us for activism on the streets. Well, last year, we were standing on the streets of Hamilton when we were doing choice chain with these people who had joined us for the crash course, and there was a man who was yelling at our volunteer, Christine. And he was especially angry about the fact that born children might be seeing these images. And so Christine explained that we too think it is a shame that parents might have to explain to their born children that this is being done to preborn children. And if we could, we would show these pictures in a different way. But the reality is that no one wants to see them. She explained how the response of parents often dictates the response of children. And then she said, but if we have to choose between the feelings of born children and the lives of preborn children, shouldn't we prioritize the latter? And then she pointed out to him that there might be women walking around here on the streets who are trying to decide what to do with their unwanted pregnancy, and we hope that they will reconsider having an abortion upon seeing these pictures. And at that time, a soft-spoken woman whom Christine hadn't noticed up until that moment spoke up and said, yes, and I'm one of them. She was one of those women whom we hope to reach. All of a sudden, the man who was angry and yelling vanished as if into thin air, and so Christine had the opportunity to talk to this woman, and she found out that she was in an abusive relationship, and that her boyfriend was telling her to kill it, to get rid of it, rather, otherwise he would kill her. She also found out that this woman had been told that pro-lifers don't care about women and babies. They only care about fetuses and embryos. But in Christine and in our team, she found a group of people willing to walk with her and support her in whatever she needed. And after seeing these pictures and being provided with the support and resources she needed, she chose not to have an abortion. And on a cold morning in March, we received this picture. Baby Noah is alive today because his mom saw what abortion would have done to his little body. That's what happens when we expose the injustice of abortion for what it truly is. But Noah is not the only one. This past summer, our interns were standing on the streets of Hamilton once again, and there was a couple who walked by our choice chain, and a boyfriend turned to his girlfriend and said, "That's what you're gonna do to our baby." One of our interns immediately engaged him in conversation, and after about an hour, the young woman said that those pictures are really effective because she couldn't do that to her child. Several weeks later, we were able to take her for her first ultrasound. And next week, 2 of my colleagues will be going to an ultrasound with them again. Another baby's life was saved because her mom, her dad, saw what abortion would have done. I can stand here all night and tell you stories like this. But the most important thing for us to remember is that the pro-life cause is not ours. It is the cause of preborn children who cannot speak for themselves, and so they need us to do it for them, and to do so as effectively as possible, using the tools that change the most minds and save the most lives. For if we don't, more children die. That will cost us something, but that shouldn't surprise us, because doing what is right is often also most difficult. Someone who knew that very well was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who resisted the Nazi regime and spoke out against them, was captured and killed because of it. But he once said that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. We who know better have the responsibility to share that knowledge with the people around us, because if we don't, and they make that abortion choice in ignorance, then our sin, their sin of commission, becomes our sin of omission. Last year, I had the opportunity to debate Dr. Fraser Fellows, late-term abortionist in London, Ontario. I was 23 weeks and 3 days pregnant, and Dr. Fellows does abortions up to 24 weeks. That night, I couldn't fall asleep, and I couldn't help but think of the man who has been doing abortions for more than 40 years and who will soon appear before God's judgment seat with the blood of children dripping from his fingers. But I also couldn't sleep because I thought of us, because I am convinced that we will stand there with him and that God will ask of us what we have done for the least of these. The bad news is abortion. 300 children in our country every single day, and the sewers of our cities run red with the blood of the most innocent in our nation. But the good news is that that can change. The good news is that when people rise up to defend those who do not have a voice, our society notices. The good news is that when we prioritize the lives of preborn children above our own comfort, that sends a message to the people around us who live in a society that mostly cares about self. I am hopeful because I have seen what happens when we expose the injustice and people don't just live for themselves anymore. In 2011, CCBR had 5 full-time people on staff. And recently, we had this staff picture taken. We are the survivor generation, and we have the responsibility to speak up for our peers who did not make it out of the womb alive. We engage our culture in order to change our culture. We expose the injustice so that it will end. And we've had the privilege of meeting children and holding babies whose lives were saved because of it. That's how we change minds. That's how we save lives. And with God's help, that's how we will end abortion in Canada. But maybe you wonder, but how does changing public opinion actually translate into changing law? What about that legal vacuum of no restrictions on abortion in our country whatsoever? Well, the fact is that you need to change public opinion before you can change public policy. But does that mean that there is nothing we can do? The answer is no. There are incremental steps we can take now to save some as we work towards saving all. And Mike is going to tell you more about that. Thank you.